Well, hello, church. This is Pastor Kevin Golden. Thank you for joining us today. If you've never been to our website, I encourage you to go and check us out at roaringriversofgrace.com. There you can donate to the ministry, contact us with any questions or comments you might have with the contact button, or send us your prayer requests. There's a prayer request button there. And of course, you can learn more about the church. I would love to hear from you, and look forward to seeing you next week as well on Sunday at 1 p.m. Central Time. You can come to roaringriversofgrace.com, and there'll be a link at the top to join us live. Right now, we're in a series, reading the Bible through my own eyes, and we're discussing the 7 progressive covenants of the Bible. And this week, we're going to be talking about the Mosaic, or the Old Covenant, also known as the Law. Turn down. Okay. So the Bible is a book of covenants, and 7 in all to be exact. If we understand the stipulations of each of these covenants and their progression, keyword progression, leading to the last one, which is the Messianic or New Covenant, we can get a pretty clear picture of the heart and nature of God. Implicated in this statement is the opposite of this. If we don't have a clear understanding of the stipulations of each covenant and their progression leading to the last one, then we don't have a clear picture of the heart and nature of God. And unfortunately, that is the current state of the Western church today, especially the evangelical side of the church, because they don't have a clear understanding of these 7 covenants. So what is a covenant? A covenant is an agreement or a contract between 2 parties. It is constituted through promises made by each party with stipulated benefits of blessing and curses based upon the condition of keeping said promises. It is usually ratified by the shedding of blood, and it may also be conditional or unconditional. The understanding of biblical covenants is paramount to the understanding of the character and integrity of God. And most evangelical churches today do not recognize the value of biblical covenants, because covenantalism was replaced by dispensationalism, which brought to a close the value of God dealing with man through the covenants. So today we're going to talk about the Mosaic covenant, which is the Old Covenant, also known as the Law. And this is how it came about. By the time Moses was born, the 75 people that went with Israel, or Jacob, into Egypt during the time of Joseph's influence had grown into over 1 million or more people. The Israelites had been subjected under bondage to the Egyptians, and then eventually began to cry out to God for deliverance. God heard their cry and sent them a deliverer from among their brethren, and that deliverer was Moses. This covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Law, being conditional and made at Mount Sinai 50 days after leaving Egypt, is a covenant to reveal transgression or unbelief. This is key. This covenant was given to reveal transgression or unbelief. Notice that 50 days after Passover, remember Passover was, remember they were in Egypt, they were under bondage. Moses said, "Let my people go," to the Egyptian Pharaoh, and Pharaoh would not let them go after 9 plagues that really devastated Egypt, but he still wouldn't let the Israelites go because they were the slaves upon which their economy was built. And so he wasn't about to let them go. And so finally, the 10th plague that God was sending was that the firstborn would be killed. And so God made provision for the Israelites that if they would sacrifice a lamb and put the blood of the lamb upon the doorpost of their home, that the death angel would pass over their houses and the firstborn would not be killed. And of course, that's what happened. The Israelites were all saved, including the firstborn. However, the Egyptians were not spared because they were not given this provision of this Passover lamb. And so that was the first time that Passover took place. And of course, since then, in Judaism, they celebrate that event with the Feast of Passover. So 50 days later, which is Pentecost, that word there, Penta, meaning 50, was another feast established for a celebration for 50 days after this Passover. This is when they come to the mountain of Sinai, and God offers them one thing, they reject it because of their unbelief, and so they demand a different type of covenant, and that covenant is a conditional covenant. That is what they get here with the law. So the law was then given, or the old covenant. On that day, 3,000 people died. And there's a whole story behind that. But basically, essentially, they broke the law, the covenant that they had just made. And 3,000 people died. But in stark contrast, 50 days after the Feast of Passover, which was the night before Jesus was crucified, when the new covenant was given, on the day of Pentecost, and this is in Acts chapter 2, the Spirit was given and 3,000 people came alive. And of course, we can read in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, a statement that really just encapsulates that whole picture, the contrast between the old and the new covenant, where it says the letter kills, meaning the letter of the law or the old covenant kills, but the Spirit gives life. It's no coincidence that on Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, in the old covenant, 3,000 people died, but in the new, in Acts chapter 2, 50 days after the Passover lamb, the real Passover lamb, which is Christ, was hung on a cross. 50 days later, on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit fell, then the church was birthed, 3,000 people came alive. They came into the kingdom. That's not a coincidence. So back to the old covenant. The civil codes of the law were given for the preservation of a society. It is also of the utmost importance to note that this covenant is an adjunct covenant. It was a supplemental covenant with the Abrahamic covenant, meaning it's a temporary, non-essential covenant. The covenant that they had already been given was the Abrahamic covenant, and they rejected it. God said to them at Mount Sinai that he wanted to make them a nation of priests. He wanted to have a one-on-one relationship with each one of the children of Israel. And he said, just simply receive the covenant of your father. What covenant? There was only one, and that was the Abrahamic covenant. And so they rejected this covenant because it's a covenant of faith that says God's greater, so he's going to bless you, the lesser, and all you have to do is believe. It was accounted unto Abraham righteousness because of his faith, not because of his performance, his works, the following of any rules, but because of his faith. He simply believed that God was and that God wanted to bless him because of God's love for him. That's the covenant that the children of Israel had. That's what they were offered again at Mount Sinai. That's what they rejected, and they demanded instead a covenant that they knew from the days of being in Egyptian slavery. They saw God as the gods of Egypt, hard taskmasters, a God who would punish because of not following the rules, or would bless if the rules were followed. And they said, give us this covenant of rules and we'll follow. So this covenant was given to Israel with a twofold purpose. First, a society in multiple generations of bondage is dumbed down. Critical thinking skills have been dismantled. For decades, each generation was told what, how, when, and where to go, or what to do. Therefore, the civil law within the Old Covenant law was given to rebuild their critical thinking skills of a people who could not lead themselves. Secondly, when the people received the law, their response to Moses was, we are well able to do what God requires of us. And you can see this in Deuteronomy 5:27. The law was given primarily to expose their transgression of unbelief and pride to prove they could never attain justification through self-righteous works. This is very, very key. Today, people in the Western church are still trying to keep this law to prove that they can earn their right standing, their justification with God by keeping the rules. And nothing could be further from the truth. The whole point of the law was to reveal this transgression of unbelief, that God simply is a father of love who wants to bless his children and just wants us to believe that and believe in him. And that is not what most Christians are doing today. They're doing the same thing that the children of Israel did at Mount Sinai and did for 1400, 1800 years after the law was given. And that is that I can do this, give me the rules, I can follow it, and that'll make me righteous. And that's just not the truth. So we should note that when a people enslaved are freed too suddenly, their shame is replaced with arrogance. This is the case with the Hebrew children, or the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. Therefore, in Exodus 19:5-6, God, through Moses, said this: if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be my own possession. Now, what covenant was he talking about there? There was only one ratified at the time, and that's the Abrahamic covenant, which we discussed a few moments ago. The covenant was just one of just believe. That's it. The people of one accord reply, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and an adjunct covenant of performance is now sealed. In the next chapter, God gives them the 10 commandments, and in much of the rest of Exodus and most of Leviticus and a good portion of Numbers and Deuteronomy, God reveals even more requirements. The covenant is divided into 3 parts: the moral law, which is the 10 commandments in Exodus 20, the civil or judicial law, and these are the precepts of the judicial system for the punishment of crimes and settlement of disputes. You can see that in Exodus 21. Then we have the ceremonial law in Exodus 25, and this is the required religious system and its protocols, including the details of sacrifice, worship, the priesthood, and offerings. This covenant also displayed a sign, the Sabbath day, and here we must note this covenant was between God and Israel alone. All others, meaning Gentiles, meaning everyone who's not Jewish, still lived under the covenant of conscience. You can see that in Romans 2:12-16. We must be aware that when one tries to place a doctrine peculiar to one covenant into another, the result is heresy. This is spiritual adultery. And you can see this explained by Paul in Romans chapter 7, verses 1-6, where he's using the picture of marriage to tell a principle. And today, preachers will try to use this set of scripture to preach marriage principles. And that is not at all what Paul was trying to do. He was simply using, as a Jew, as a Middle Easterner would do, using pictures to tell a story or to get a point across, to get a principle across. And that picture was marriage. And what the point he was trying to make is when you try to mix the old covenant law with the new covenant, it's spiritual adultery. And unfortunately, as I've said earlier, this is what the Western Evangelical Church is doing today. And it is creating all kinds of problems in people's lives. So the covenant of the law was in effect and enforced from Mount Sinai until the cross, a period of 1,500 years. And that concludes our brief study of the Mosaic Old Covenant law. And something I want to point out here is that this portion of the Bible, of the Old Testament, is yet just a portion of the Old Testament. It's not the entirety of the Old Testament. And it is not the entirety of the Bible. And yet people today in the Christian church will take this portion of the Bible, the time of the Old Covenant from given to Moses at Mount Sinai until Christ, and they will try to superimpose it across the entire Bible and onto our modern day lives and onto God's character for all of time. And this is a huge mistake. This is how we get to today, where much people in the church and much of the world who has heard from the church believes that God is mean and angry and hateful and wrath-filled and ready to judge everything and beat people over the head for making a mistake. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because we see we create this picture of God from reading the portion of the Old Testament called during the time of the Old Covenant, from Moses until the end of Malachi. And it looks as though God just wants to kill everybody for making the smallest mistakes, when in fact, he's just being faithful to the covenant that he's in. So in this time period, this 1500-year time period from Moses until Christ, anytime that the Jews break the law, which there's 613 laws here, the law says that you're guilty. If you break one, you're guilty of it all. And therefore the curse of the law comes upon you. Now remember, this is what they demanded. The children of Israel wanted this type of covenant because their unbelief that God is good and that he wanted to bless them with this Abrahamic covenant was too much for them to handle. They could not receive it. So they demanded this type of a covenant instead. What is this type? It's a vassal covenant. This is what they would see. This is what would have been exhibited to them from the gods of Egypt to the Egyptian people. And so since they were in slavery there for 400 years, they thought, oh, well, this must be how our God is. And this must be the type of covenant that he wants us to have. And you know what? We just spent 400 years proving that we can perform, we can follow the rules because we're slaves. So now they have the same mentality that they bring into this conversation with God at Mount Sinai, where he says, you have a covenant of blessing, just believe. And they say, nope, give us the rules we're well able to perform. And now demanding a totally different type of covenant than what the heart of God was. And since that's the covenant they wanted, and that's the covenant that God had to give them to reveal their unbelief, he is now obligated, according to the covenant that he made with them, to allow the curses that they called upon themselves during the covenant ceremony of walking between the two mountains of blessing and cursing. And they said, so be it to the curses. God is obligated to allow those curses to come upon them, because if he doesn't, then that makes him unfaithful to the covenant. And God is not a man that he should lie, and God is always faithful. And so because of this, people take this out of context and see this God allowing the curse that they called upon themselves to come on them. And they say, oh, wow, God is mean and hateful and wrath-filled and angry and wants to beat us up for every mistake that we make. And we bring this into modern day Christianity, which again is that adulterous marrying of the old and the new covenants. And then we go out and we tell the world that that's how God is. And we wonder why people in the world don't want our God, and why people in the church still struggle today, when they are, according to the new covenant, according to Paul, they are free from sin. And yet we still see people struggling desperately with it because they don't believe that, because that's not what they're being taught. They believe they have this sin-filled flesh nature, and they're just going to be this way, and they have to fight against it, and God's going to strike them dead and send them to hell if they don't follow these rules. And they don't even know which rules to follow. And they try to separate out this moral, civil, and ceremonial law. Well, we don't have to keep that part of it, but we got to keep this part of it. No, the law says if you break one, you're guilty of them all. So it's all or nothing deal. So we should not be trying to take this old covenant law and marry it to the new covenant, committing spiritual adultery, and then wonder why we have such difficult lives, and why we have struggles with sin, and why we're so judgmental and hateful, and why people don't want anything to do with our God. When in fact, God is a God of grace. God is only operating in the new covenant. God is God of love. He is love. And that's who we should be preaching the good news of that to the people of the world. Not one of not a God of wrath and hate and anger. So let's try to leave this in the context that it was written, which is the 1500-year period from Mount Sinai until Christ. And first of all, if you're not a Jewish person by birth, this covenant was never for you in the first place. So you're doubly wrong for trying to bring this into the church, because it was never for you in the first place. Much less now that we have been redeemed from the law of sin and death, because Christ hung on the cross for us, and we're in Christ, and we are now heirs to the blessing of Abraham. So, I don't know if you've ever seen the Saturday Night Live skit with the guy from Bob Newhart. I don't know if that's his name or if that was his show name, but he's like a psychiatrist, and this lady comes in and she's like, I have this problem with this, and and his response is just always, stop it. but I have this problem with this, stop it. So that's my response to the church today. If you're trying to mix this old covenant into your new covenant world, is stop it. It's just not right. It's not biblical. It's not good for you. It is not building the kingdom. It is not edifying you or anyone around you. Stop it. So with that, I will leave you with that and say thank you for attending. I love all of you. I bless you. Please, if you have any prayer requests, have any questions, have any comments, go to the website, roaringriversofgrace.com, and click the contact or prayer request button, and that will come straight to me. And if you'd like to sow into the ministry, I would greatly appreciate it. There's also a donate button there as well. And please invite somebody next week to join us live Sunday at 1 p.m. Central Time, right here on this same link. Love you guys. Bless you. Have a great day.